Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to the March edition of the Lake States Fire Science Consortium webinar series. I am Jack Stinsky, and I serve as the program manager for the consortium. I will be moderating the webinar this afternoon. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and are one of 14 regional consortia across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and adoption of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive neutral science partners working to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners, organizations, and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to science delivery while facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. Before we get started, let's take a few seconds and look at our webinar interfaces in Adobe Connect. First, if you'd like to ask a question or interact with any of the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower left-hand portion of the screen. Once you type your question, just click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions and we'll make sure that there is an opportunity to address them. Second, we recommend that you maximize the webinar window to full screen on your computer. Finally, if you would like to learn more about the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and what we are doing, please visit our website at lakestatesfiresci.net. Please sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements of our activities. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. On to today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Dr. Gregory Corace. Greg is a wildlife biologist at the U.S. Wildlife Service's Seney National Wildlife Refuge, located in Michigan's eastern Upper Peninsula, and also for the Kirtland's Wildlife Management Area in northern Lower Peninsula. His main duties include formulating refuge goals and objectives, as well as overseeing research, inventorying, monitoring, and land management. Greg received a BS in zoology and an MS in biology from Northern Michigan University and his PhD in forest science from Michigan Technological University. Greg holds adjunct assistant professor positions at Michigan Technological University, Central Michigan University, The Ohio State University, and Wayne State University, and assists with the guidance of graduate students conducting studies on National Wildlife Refuge System. With that, I'd like to turn control of the webinar over to Greg. Go ahead, Greg.
Thanks, Jack. And thank you, everybody who's in attendance today. Special thanks to my co-authors, Lynn Shartell and Dawn Marsh, and my colleagues and PI members in the Lake State Fire Science Consortium. So today we're going to talk about some work funded through the consortium that looks at extending our knowledge as it now exists for wildlife communities of fire-dependent ecosystems of the States. Brief presentation outline. We're going to first introduce the audience to those fire-dependent ecosystems with which we work. Talk briefly about the need, goals, and objectives of this project specifically, and then talk about some other fire-related research that's been ongoing, potential applications, and next steps. My hope is that I can be succinct today and give us plenty of time to talk about needs in the wildlife research world moving forward. So, where do we sit? The first slide that you see is right from our Lake States Fire Consortium website. The top arrow notes those geographic areas that we cover in the consortium for the most part. We're working in the northern tier of the 3 states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, with some coverage area in New York and Ontario and other Canadian provinces as well. The ecosystems in which we work that are our priorities are listed by that second arrow on the bottom, and I'm not going to go into too much detail with what ecosystems we cover, but the users can go to our website and see these in detail there. Briefly, the ecosystems that we deal with include a range of conifer upland types and as well as wetland types. The first photo you see here is taken from some of our demonstration sites in the lower peninsula of Michigan. Consortium has a number of demonstration sites across the consortium area. What you see here is fire-induced jet pine conditions inhabited by Gilliland's warbler in the northern lower. One of the ecosystems, or range of ecosystems that we're interested in the work we're doing today, includes jack pine rims and all the way to closed canopy jack pine forests. We're also interested in later successional pine communities, such as this old growth stand of red pine found at Seney National Wildlife Refuge. And then we're interested in a really complex arrangement of fire-dependent communities that can be found in wetland areas. What you see here is a Seney Wilderness area and the Strangmore Bog National Natural Landmark. It's one of the largest pattern fens in the lower 48 states, and it really is a heterogeneous mix of upland pine islands, lowland conifers, and sedge communities. And as we all know, all these fire-dependent communities behave differently under fire. What you see is the Mack Lake Fire in 1980 down in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. Photo shows what we all know is a lot of energy can be released in fire as it goes through jack pine forests. These are often high severity stand replacing events. They differ quite a bit with low severity surface fire we find in our red pine community. This is a prescribed fire here at Seney in one of our benchmark red pine forests. As you can tell, flame length and everything like that is quite different than in the jack pine previous slide. And what you see in a wetland burn of mixed severity here at Seney, a whole array of different conditions out on the ground. So in brief, fire-dependent ecosystems differ in composition of plant and animal species, and this leads to different characteristics such as fire return interval, rotation, seasonality, severity, intensity, etc. One of the things that we're trying to do in the project we're talking about today is linking fire-dependent ecosystems with wildlife, mostly vertebrate, species that are associated with those ecosystems. It's important to note that there are linkages between fire and other ecological processes. For instance, in the work we've done here at Seney looking at historic fire regimes, there is a strong correlation between hydrology and drought events and fire. So rarely is fire acting in a vacuum. It's usually acting in concert with other processes out on the land. And unfortunately, relative to much of the U.S., we really don't know much about prescribed fire or wildfire effects on wildlife in the northern Lake states. Jessica at Michigan State University has been working on some kind of knowledge gap analysis, and she's shown how little we actually do know in many of these topics here in the Lake states. So what is the need, goals, and objectives of this work? Which vertebrate species are fire dependent? The need really revolves around how we're shifting in our focus of being stewards of the land, not only on wildlife refuges, but on many national forests, other public lands, and other private lands. We're shifting from highly focused single species or single commodity management practices to an attempt, at least, to be more holistic. What you see in front of you, this slide shows Canada geese activity and banding efforts here at Seney back in about 1939. You see the geese upside down, kissed into that spinning table. They go around, you draw blood on them, weigh them, you put bands on them, and you move on. We spent better part of 2 decades here at Seney primarily doing work with Canada goose. We, like many other land managers, are now being asked to do much more. We know the land is changing, and it's changing rapidly for many reasons. Management is therefore more and more looking at how things function, how processes work with patterns, and the relationship with surrounding landowners and landships. We're not the only one to be looking at this. Groups like the Landscape Conservation cooperatives using or led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are really asking for partnerships and folks looking outside the boundaries of their land units. Fire. Why are we interested in fire? Well, we know across the northern tier of the lake states, among other places, that the loss of fire or the alteration of fire regimes has caused dramatic changes. This slide shows work done by Lisa Schulte in a landscape ecology paper. What it is that really a decline in pine species across these ecoregions. They're primarily linked to the decline in fire acting as an important factor in regeneration. So with these knowledge gaps or these ecoregional specific needs and information, the Joint Fire Sciences Program went out and formed consortia across the country. This is a map of the consortia that now exist, and you can see the relationship to our neighbors in the tall grass and the Appalachian, et cetera. Consortia were developed in part because of the lack of knowledge and the need to be more eco-regional and provide that knowledge. Here in the Lake States, fire research is really in its infancy in many ways. Unlike many parts of the country, the southeast and west, we know very little about some of our fire communities. To some degree, that's a product of the history of fire here in the Lake States. What you see on this slide in front of you are white pine stump fields in the eastern UP of Michigan. These forests were cut over about 100 years ago. Slash fires burned across the landscape, altering soil characteristics, and really retarding generation and succession. This history of land management or extraction really is in some ways biasing our approach to fire and our knowledge of fire in the Lake States. So what are our objectives for wildlife and fire project? Well, we have 5 main objectives. Our first, to improve our available database on literature. Our second is to work with colleagues and the literature to come up with and characterize our wildlife communities. Our third is to work with partners and come up with a list of shared interests, including monitoring and inventory and research on these wildlife species and their ecosystems. The fourth is to produce an exchange at a professional event. We're thinking about Indianapolis at the Midwest Wildlife Conference next February in Indianapolis, for instance. And then our fifth, hopefully, is we as professionals can come up with research need statements that we can funnel up to Boise through the consortium. Okay. So where are we with these objectives? And Jessica at Michigan State University did a lot of work over the last few years trying to compile a publication database for fire effects in the Lake States. That database is available to all users on the consortium website. The red arrow here shows you where you can find that. Currently, we are updating that as information comes across our desks on wildlife-related aspects. Where we really are having problems are finding all the theses and dissertations out there on fire-related projects. They really are tough to find. So if any attendees to this webinar know of any literature that is not available on that, feel free to send it to me and we'll put it on to Jessica. So that's the first objective. That's kind of what we're working on that. The second objective is we went to the available literature, including state wildlife action plans, breeding bird atlases, other texts on distribution of wildlife species, and we started compiling a list of mammals, herpetofauna, and bird species that we believe that are associated with wildlife fire-dependent ecosystems, rather. Here's an example of those fire-dependent bird species. This is just an example of a suite of species that we propose are fire-dependent. One of the things that you note about or that we are noting about birds is that there are multiple fire-dependent ecosystem types that many bird species use. That's somewhat different with the mammals and the herpetofauna that seem to be more specific to one ecosystem type or another. The slide shows a list of fire-dependent mammals, these examples that we find in open wetlands, conifer swamps, and dry coniferous forests. Again, there are a number of species and a number of fire-dependent ecosystem types used. And then herpetofauna, again, more examples of species that we find in. So overall, we have encountered, or we have classified 13 species of herpetofauna that are associated with fire-dependent ecosystem types that we in the Lake States Fire Science Consortium are working with. When we lump those ecosystem types into simpler categories to talk about, you'll see in this graph that they're predominantly found in dry forests or wetland ecosystems. A similar pattern found for the 15 mammal species that we have so far classified as fire dependent. Again, dry forests and wetland ecosystems have the most species, but we also have them in more mesic and wet forests. By far, the most species that we consider fire dependent are bird species. Not surprising, as it's a more species-rich taxon. So we again have wetland and dry forest species predominating, with wet forest and mesic forest species following that up. What's interesting is that after we come up with our species list, send it out for some peer review and cut it down and adapt and add to it, we then link that species list across the consortium area to different lists for each state or province of a species conservation status. The slide you see now is for Wisconsin, and those fire-dependent species that we categorize and their bird conservation value. If you remember, we had, I think, 48 or 46 species overall, and in Wisconsin alone, 43 of them have some status of conservation priority, whether species of conservation need, GCN, species of conservation, a threatened species, or an endangered species. We seem to be working with a suite of species that have high conservation value. So those are some of the species that we're working with and their status in different states. Now I'm going to kind of cover some of the potential applications of this work and where we're going from here. So I think Kirtland's warbler is the quintessential fire-dependent species, provides a good example for the kind of application of the type of work we're doing. The slide in front of you shows both the U.S. distribution of jack pine, we're on the southern tier of jack pine in North America, and the world's distribution of Kirtland's warbler. In the last few years, we've seen some colonization of jack pine stands in Wisconsin and in Ontario, but still 90% of all birds are found in Michigan. That, however, is expected to change, as many of the models say habitat suitability for jack pine is headed north. We don't know what the impact on Kirtland's will be. We do know, however, that Kirtland's evolved to use stand placing fire in jack pine. Here's jack pine stand on Fish and Wildlife Service property in the northern lower. Note the heterogeneity in that stand and the young jack pine for Kirtland's. Unfortunately, there's almost been no research done whatsoever on associates and Kirtland specifically in many fire-induced habitat. What we've done with Kirtland's is we put them in a condition where most management is predicated on producing timber products, go into mature jack stands, we harvest them, clear cut, maybe with reserves. We then plant, either hand plant or machine plant young jack pine seedlings, and then we grow a plantation for Kirtland's warbler. At intensive management, we have a kind of rough idea of associated bird communities of that. as this slide shows you, but we don't really have it for fire-induced stands. Again, it's our lack of knowledge on fire and wildlife in lake states is pronounced. So, if jack pine heads northward, what are we going to do with Kirtland's warbler? Well, there's already interest in looking in the eastern UP of Michigan and elsewhere on promoting jack pine habitat for Kirtland's warbler, and it's already being done on some lands. The map you see in front of you was done in about 2008, and it showed you the distribution of singing male warblers, that's the blue triangles that you see, among ecoregions of the East UP and some county lines as well. What you will see is this ecoregion, Seney Sand Lake Plain, which is about 1 million acres, 10% of that area covered by Seney Refuge. That's a sand lake plain, kind of very different than, let's say, this large outwash area, including the Raco Plains over in the Forest Service, Hiawatha National Forest. The point here being we have different landforms that now have jack pine on them. Some historically were jack pine dominated, some were less so. So there's trade-offs. And we've been looking at some of the trade-offs between jack pine management and management that restores late successional mixed pine. The slide you see in front of you is from John Kotar, and it's really his habitat type system and successional trajectories leading up to predict white pine and red pine communities. And you'll see the bold line around jack pine, red pine tends to indicate and sites those are currently dominant cover type. We've been studying the role of fire and other disturbances in this successional pathway. So the first things we've done in this work is look at the fire return interval and fire history on the landscape. This slide shows you the fire return interval for fire sites here at the refuge. The area to the left of the first red line shows you the pre-European return interval fire frequency. The area covered between the two red lines is really the great cutover time period where we had more fires on the landscape, represented by each dot really. And then the area to the right of the last red line shows you the current fire activity on the landscape. Really, it's a period of fire suppression. So we've had 3 time periods with 3 very different fire regimes going on. And this has impacted composition and structure of the landscape. What you see here are the blue is reference, our old growth stands, those stands that have never been cut because they're surrounded by wetland and you can never get equipment into them. And our altered stands, those are shown here in red. What you see is the preponderance of jack pine in altered stands, lack of jack pine really in our reference stands. Stands were really red pine dominated. Our altered stands, we have placed red pine to some degree with jack pine. That is a product of the great cover and more recent management activities. Another structurally, you'll see a shift over in size classes, and you basically just have smaller trees out there. Okay. So there's trade-off. There's trade-off if we want to store the historic position structure of our forests here, or if we want to manage our current jack pine for our sweetest species and possibly and including warbler. So we know something about the dynamics on the landscape. We know something about the historic composition structure of our forests and the current composition structure. What we went out there and did is we looked at the bird communities of both, of altered stands and reference stands, trying to provide a little bit more context to the trade-offs between restoration of historic conditions and management of the current condition. And again, to get you up to speed, our reference stands are really out in that heterogeneous mix out in our wilderness area. For the most part, those are surrounded by wetland patches, and our altered stands were really on these wash channels that had ability or were conducive to management and equipment. This graph shows you if you took a 20-hectare circle around all of our bird point count plots, what you'd get in that 20-hectare patch. Really, there's more kind of a diversity of bird types, et cetera, in the altered 20-hectare patches because of surrounding land uses, whether we put in hayfield next to that point area, whether there's a pool or something like that. For the most part, though, our reference patches are quite different than our altered patches. We'll look at bird species. We did breedings and point counts. What we found interesting is that for the most part, forest bird species richness was greater in our reference sites than our altered sites. It's somewhat surprising because our reference sites, forests are reference patches, our 20-hectare patches, made up less area overall than our altered sites. These are pine islands. The reference area are pine islands out in our wilderness. And yet their small size did not seem to preclude a higher abundance of forest-dependent species in them. Yes, species have evolved with natural edges much better than anthropogenic edges. So when we look at reference sites versus altered sites and indicator species, or those species whose abundance is highly associated with those two conditions, we have twice as many indicator species in our reference and our altered, and for the most part, neotropical migrants make up the reference bird community compared to resident species, game species such as ruffed grouse. What was interesting is none of the species that really we came up with as indicators of either conditions were fire-dependent species that we typically think of in our consortium work as fire-dependent species. We did bump into black woodpeckers, spruce grouse, red crossbills, other species that we think are more associated with fire-dependent communities, but they're in such low abundance that they were precluded from further analysis. And unfortunately, there's a lot of noise out there in terms of the relationship between structural conditional variables and bird abundances. Here's a CCA tripod, and with no assumptions made on underlying distributions of any other variables, and variables collected at different scales, etc. We see a lot of noise and a lot of kind of chaos out there. What is interesting, however, is we have three variables regarding specifically fire regimes. We had number of fires in the 50 years at NF50 on the lower left-hand quadrant, NF142, number of fires in the last 142 years, and TLF, number time since last fire. Those three variables seem to be as much a driver in abundances of species as do traditional structural and compositional variables. So the point being, it seems like fire in and of itself has a play to some degree in shaping bird communities here in our reference and altered fire sites. But where does this lead us? Well, again, it leads us toward thinking about trade-offs and opportunities and limitations. This schematic shows just a hypothetical relationship between ecosystem conditions or ecosystem types and the bird species you might encounter in them. We really have no data on this per se, but this gets us to think about possibilities where we can take our consortium work in the future and look at what we get, the pros and cons across broad landscapes of managing for jack bind barrens versus all the way to managing late succession white pine and red pine. Of course, much more research and analysis. So, where do we go from here? Well, our consortium work is really in infancy. All we've done to this point is we've come up with our species list. We've linked it to ecosystem type. We've sent it out for peer review. We've updated it. We've linked that data to conservation status documents, and then we sit with the lists. What are we going to do with those lists? Well, the next step is we hope to go look at distribution maps in GIS and come up with gap analysis reports of fire-dependent wildlife communities. What you see in front of you is gap analysis for total bird species richness in the United States, and I think we all can think about how this would change if we look at fire-dependent communities and wildlife species associated with them. So that's where we've been, and that's where we're headed. And with that, I'd love to open the floor up to questions and comments, get people's feedback on what you think would help you as land managers of fire-dependent systems here in the Lake States. Jack?
Greg, for folks that have questions, please use the chat box. And Greg and I are going to watch for the next few minutes to see what things you have. So Greg will sit right here and see what questions come in. I guess the question I have in mind is, why do you think there has not been that much research as far as wildlife and fire goes with P&E species?
Boy, that answer can get me in trouble. Well, I think if we look at where money is expended from state to state or federal agency to federal agency, you will see there's a predominance of game species management. I mean, that's our history as wildlife biologists was game species 101. I think if you look at most game species, you can see species don't necessarily need fire. I think a lot of money is made on wild deer licenses here in the state of Michigan, and I don't think there's linkages between necessarily selling licenses and in the ground. So that would be my first take, Jack.
That's a good take. Again, folks, if you have questions, type them in the chat box. Greg, if individuals who are watching this or who look at the archive, are you still accepting questions or willing to give up the list for you?
That's right. If anyone contacts me, I would gladly provide a list, hoping that we get feedback on changes of the list, additions, deletions, etc. We sent that out for about a month of peer review, and we got about 6 active or suggestions on what to add or delete. And of course, we need more. What we need to get, a couple main points we need to get through is one, again, every ecosystem type in which we're working in doesn't just have fire acting. Some of the, for instance, marsh bird folks were surprised that we called our wetlands for dependent. We were just having a meeting on this, and yes, hydrology is the driver for many things in these wetlands as well, but there's without a question many of our, especially our non-coastal wetlands, have an important fire regime aspect to them. So there's an interaction between hydrology and fire. They both kind of sometimes work in concert to shape, for instance, bird communities out there.
Certainly. So again, people want to contact you, they should use the email that's provided on the screen.
You bet.
Okay. And do you have a deadline, or rough deadline of when you'd like to have this review?
Every time we set up a deadline, we kind of set ourselves up for failure to some degree. No, because this is a fluid activity right now. Where we'd like to be putting most of our energy moving forward is, for instance, at gap mapping, and secondly, getting people to coordinate or discuss amongst themselves, for instance, some inventory monitoring protocols. We know there's folks over in Wisconsin, who've recently done some spruce grouse work. I hear Minnesota is starting up some spruce grouse work / research. We here in Michigan haven't been doing that much with spruce grouse for a while. My hope is that we can kind of do some outreach and linkages among these people so that we can share expertise, maybe especially for land managers, not reinvent the wheel every time we come up with a new protocol. So that's where we are right now. No, there's no deadline on feedback. We're going to want it from here on out.
Okay. So individuals that are watching this webinar or are looking at the archive could get back to you. And I encourage anybody who's watching this, whether you can provide feedback or not, if you can think of anybody else to provide feedback, certainly give them Greg's contact information. Michelle asked, are you looking at invasive species in any way as you do this work? Is there any linkages?
No, we are not. Of course, that's an important component. Jack, you might want to tell them the work we are, as a consortium, are doing with invasive plants. At this point in time, I mean, we've got enough work ahead of us just saying what are the fire-dependent wildlife species that we are working with. There's a question, for instance, in our wetland communities that there are some invasives out there, glossy buckthorn, et cetera, that are an impediment to many things. But for the most part, no, we are not working with invasive species right now.
Okay. I guess maybe a follow-up with that is with the various reviews you've done, have you noticed any link between either reference or the altered? Do the altered have a species in them, or is that not kind of clear?
No, we've looked at that. Everything from earthworms to plants, and I think Abrams and Nowacki wrote about this. I mean, benefit from most of our pine systems are so nutrient poor and dry that they're almost devoid completely of any invasive plants. And they do have a few non-native earthworms in them. They're not the giant earthworm that we all think about. But for the most part, here at Seney, those pine communities that we're working in are invasive, totally invasive free. There's a little spot in Nepweed that's on the road edge, but that's about it.
That's nice in the sense that pretty invasive, neutral. The other areas have a lot of invasives.
Yeah, lock gates are very, very helpful. Keeping vehicular traffic to a minimum, I think, is a big positive.
Good, good. Okay, I'm looking. We'll give it a minute, please. Type if you have additional questions. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping up the webinar. Let's give it just a few more seconds here.
Maybe I have questions for everyone out there. Any species that folks want to see some protocols developed for? Monitoring, inventory, and the like. Any species that aren't T&E that people think we really need to promote some research on? Don't say yellow rail.
Those are good questions, Greg. And we're getting a few typing here, so. Michelle said choke for the wetlands, Steve.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a Marsh working group that is in existence, and we actually have a member of that, Monfils from Michigan Natural Features Institute, that's kind of on a kind of advisory group for consortium work here, and so we've got somebody who would listen to that, and I'll move that on to Mike. I don't think he's in attendance today.
Okay. Jeremy suggested, thinking about climate change, fire, and budworm may be interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I don't know if folks are aware, but the University of Wisconsin worked with the Landscape Conservation Cooperative on looking at climate change effects on priority wildlife species as identified by states primarily, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and it's etc. That report just came out. I just saw something in the report. We are trying to link our species that we identified with those that these other folks, identified as important to them, and also that we're part of this climate change vulnerability analysis. So the point is well taken that we need to be thinking down the road or thinking out ahead in terms of time and where we're going with things. We're going to try to do that in this.
All right. And we have one more suggestion. Nicholas said the Oak Savannah Historic Fire Interval for Minnesota and the Anoka Sand Plain subsection. So that might be just a consideration. We can get that down, Greg, and see if it fits into the entire Lake region.
Okay. Is that a question or is it just a comment?
I think it's a comment. I mean,
Okay.
take a look at the Oak Savannah Historic Fire Interval, and that's for Minnesota, Anoka Sand subsection.
Okay. Oak Savannahs are not, and I don't know if that's just a neat, okay, it looks like it's, just to clarify, Oak Savannahs are not one of our ecosystem types of focus in the consortium. That said, I will take a look at sand plain subsection.
Right, we'd have to determine is it actually oak pine barrens, where it falls into.
Yeah.
If it is more the Oak Savannah, this would be the type of information we could pass off to the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savannah Fire Science Consortium. That might fall into their region. We do have another individual typing. See if we have another suggestion or question. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping it up. Any other thoughts, Greg, as we're waiting to see what's coming in the chat box?
Well, trying to do something like we are trying to do with the consortium of wildlife is a somewhat daunting task because we know so little on most of these species in the lake states. We've gone back to both the literature database for the consortium and for the bird species, the Birds of North America account, which are kind of species summaries that are literature heavy. When we went back to the literature, looking at the species we've come up with, especially birds, and thought about our geographical coverage in the consortium, when we looked at the literature and saw how many papers you word fire in them or in a keyword, other than woodpeckers, it's almost no mention. So, it's just more evidence that we really don't know much about anything here in the lake. It's about really fire effects and wildlife. So we're just trying to start the process. It's going to be a long process. Starting the process by actually starting to talk about species as being associated or having high affinity for fire-dependent systems. So that's where we are. We got a lot of work to do ahead of us, but really need the feedback and the comments and the suggestions by folks like those in attendance today.
Sure. Okay. We've had two additional questions. Carrie asked, with WNS syndrome becoming a bigger issue, how about providing some information about BMPs for conducting prescribed burns without affecting bat species?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that's really a purview of what we've been funded to do. It's something I'm going to write down and maybe can pick up that conversation from there.
Okay. And then another question from Michelle. She's asking, are you looking for birds? Are you willing to consider other species like eastern Massasauga rattlesnake? And I think partly because you showed that the majority of the information you had on birds, but you also showed herpetofauna and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. We're covering the three broad tax of mammals, like their classes, mammals, birds, and herpetofauna. Yes, so eastern Massasauga, of course, is one of ours. And it's surprising, again, and Jack, you know this, there is some literature out there on eastern Massasauga, and and fire effects, but a lot of the stuff was theses and stuff like that that's difficult for us to find and get into the database. So one of the things we need to be telling our graduate students is that when your thesis is done, you're not done. Got to get that literature out in peer-reviewed stuff out in the primary literature.
And that's an excellent point. And all those online, for instance, if they know of any that kind of gray literature that's been done through type thesis, that kind of information, we can get that to us, get it to Justin Meisel, that can go into the gaps analysis database.
Yeah, and anyone knowing any theses, any dissertations, any gray literature out there on any of these fire effects, wildlife, any of this stuff, can probably contact any CI in the consortium. We can move that on. I'm more than willing to move it on if it's kind of life related, so feel free to email that to me as well.
All right.
Well, thank you.
We'll wrap up here. Thanks, Greg. I'd like to thank you, Greg. Thank everyone online for joining this session. Remember, this is recorded, so please pass this on to individuals. Definitely make sure you note Greg's contact information so that you can pass it on to others too if you want to talk to Greg more about this. I want to take the opportunity to highlight the next Lake States Fire Science Consortium webinar. And let me move the screen here. It's going to be April 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. It's looking at incorporating the principles of natural disturbance into development and evaluation of forest management for the boreal forest region of Ontario. This will be presented by Rob Rempel of Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. So again, I would encourage you guys to take a look at the archived webinars or let additional people know about the archived webinars. Also, when we close out this recording, you should get a pop-up window. It's a very short survey. We can take that survey. That information is very important so that we can review fire science. This concludes today's webinar. Again, I'd like to say thanks to Greg and everyone online for participating today. And I'm going to take a few seconds to close out, but I want to have a great rest of the day.